Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you joining us for the Right Circle this evening. We are sitting in Jaipur, and our speakers, one is in Spain and one is in UK. So it's truly, in one sense, a global event. The Right Circle is done in association with Prabhakatan Foundation and is sponsored and presented by Sri Cements in association again with SAS Women and Spagia Foundation, and of course, Siahi, who does all the organizing and programming. Today, we have two very accomplished stalwarts with us. I have Pallavi Aiyar. I've been following her work for many years now, and this is the first time that we've managed to do a session with her. She is an award winning foreign correspondent and writer. She writes for a global travel newsletter called the Global Jigsaw and is also an editor for the online magazine The Globalist. But that's not what we're focusing on. The fact is that she has authored a very rich variety in terms of genres of books. So she's authored books like Smokes and Mirrors, Chinese Whiskers, Punjabi Parmesan, Dispatches from a Europe in Crisis, Babies and Bylines, Parenting on the Moves. You can imagine the versatility that that kind of inspires Pallavi's imagination. And there are many more books and many more awards to her credit, apart from being the 2014 Global Young Leader for the World Economic Forum. And I can just go on and on, but I think what you will really be enriched by is when she starts speaking about her writing experiences and about her various books. No less is our moderator, Chirag Patel, who is a co founder of the Sports Village and a former CEO for Coup Sports. And apart from that, he's also a sort of a wizard in my head. Frankly speaking, I mean, I can start talking about the fact that he's head of strategy and an M&A at Circle Global Services, etc., etc. He's also got a lot of experience in the manufacturing sector, in the technical sector. He's a multifarious, multi-talented person. Also, I can tell you, having spent time with him on a social level, with sparkling wit is this person. I'm going to leave all of you in the audience with Pallavi and Chirag to take this session forward. Thank you so much for joining us, Pallavi and Chirag. I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to be seen because I'm actually sitting in a very small by-lane of Chori Bazaar. Stepped out just to start the event and be part of it. I'm going to be listening in. But over to you, Pallavi and Chirag. And thank you so much and a very warm welcome once again.
Thanks, Meeta, and welcome, Pallavi. Uh,
Thank you.
yeah, uh, the fantastic introduction, Meeta, and please keep up the good work which you're doing through this initiative and many others in Jaipur and beyond. Look, for me to moderate this session, Pallavi and Meeta, is a lot of hard work. I had to master the art of speed reading, your latest book, which may actually mean that I do not have the foggiest idea what I'm going to ask and why. So please bear with me. Uh, it's going to be a hit and miss, but I'm sure I'll package it so that I don't demonstrate sort of speech and sound disorders. I'll try my best. But most importantly, I think, Pallavi, good to know you. I was ignorant about your existence till last week. But having glanced through your work, I have one request right at the front: is please write a book on Indians, but the confused varieties like me who were born outside India now attempting to live in India. So it's fodder for you to think about writing your next book. In the meantime, audience, please read this book. I've got it here. It's proof that I've attempted to read it. The book is titled Orienting an Indian in Japan. I think, simply put, it is Japan through her eyes and ears. And it is not only fun to read it, and I'm sure you'll polish off your English as well as part of the reading, but it's informative and inspirational in equal measure. And on my part, I promise Pallavi that I'll grab all your other books, particularly the ones on China and Indonesia. So let me first start by asking you, how did you get on this writing spree, Pallavi? And that, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself.
That's almost like asking me how I learned to breathe, because I was writing from a very, very young age. I remember being, even in primary school, perhaps grade 3 or grade 4, and writing what I used to call books, which were like those little notebooks with lined paper where you practice your handwriting. And I would fill those with stories, often, starring my classmates. And as I grew older in middle school, and I began to read a lot of Agatha Christie and other murder mysteries. I remember writing a lot of murder mysteries in which I was always the detective, and my best friend would always be the one who would get killed off in a dark room, in a closed room setting. No, so I mean, writing is something that is always attracted me, and I think partly that's because I've been a reader, and I couldn't really imagine being limited in time and space to this body and these eyes and these senses. And books have always been this portal to these, myriad other worlds and universes, and they're so expanding and enriching of one's knowledge, of one's empathy. That is something I've always been drawn to. And I began my career as a journalist, so a different kind of storyteller, first in television and then later in print journalism. I essentially found myself in China in 2002 and ended up becoming the bureau chief in China for first the Indian Express and then the Hindu over a period of about 7 years. And this was a time when China was really exploding. It was very dynamic. It was suddenly, grabbing headlines all over the place. And I was one of only 2 Indian journalists that was based in the country. And I was the only Indian journalist who learned to speak Chinese. And I traveled a lot, the length and breadth of the country. And so I was able to report from the interiors and kind of give a different window onto what was going on, specifically an Indian perspective on what was going on rather than a Western perspective, which is what most Indians actually got to read, given the lack of Indian foreign correspondents that was stationed in the country. And then that, I remember during that time, people used to keep saying, you should write a book about this. And I used to keep thinking, but I hadn't really thought about writing a book. And I always thought that if you were going to write a book, it needed to be a long-term project. Like you needed to, for example, trace the footsteps of a Buddhist monk from, Xi'an down to Nalanda in India, and then maybe write about the country through that path. And I hadn't done that. I'd never had the idea of having a book in my mind. I was really just reporting. But I then sat back and looked at the 6 or 7 years I'd spent in the country and realized that through all the reportage, there were important themes that kind of leapt out. And there was a lot when you are reporting as a journalist that you are not able to actually get across in your news report. So your reporter's diaries are full of conversations and observations that never make it to the 800 word, 1000 word piece that you end up writing for a newspaper. And there was rich material over there. And not only that, a lot of people found my story fascinating about this 26-year-old Indian girl who just washes up in China and makes a life over there. So I ended up writing my first book called Smoke and Mirrors, which was this blend of what I call the 3 A's, which is autobiography, analysis, and anecdote. And, it became a bestseller in the country. And in some ways, it then became my signature genre of, travelogue, analysis, deep reading, and also a sort of personalized touch, telling the story of my life and my family along with it. And I then did a book on Europe called Punjabi Parmesan in 2014. And now I have Orienting out on Japan. In between, I wrote 2 novels for older children called Chinese Whiskers and Jakarta Tales. And they feature 2 cats as the protagonists. And I've also done a parenting memoir, an anthology about the fault lines that are dividing India today, and also a small monograph on pollution pollution, air pollution in Delhi and Beijing. So, a very wide range of genres. And it was interesting that you said that my next book should be about, the strange kind of Indians or whatever, because since February this year, I've started writing a weekly personal essay through Substack. It's basically a weekly newsletter that goes directly into people's email inboxes. And one of the major ideas behind that is to try to examine being Indian in the world and what that means, what it means to be Indian, and explaining India to the world, understanding India while you sort of exist in other parts, so that they hold up a mirror to what India is like, and trying to kind of, look at that intersection between the global and the Indian. Through both a personal perspective and also meeting other people like you who have their own rich experiences and thoughts about this. So I don't know if it'll turn into a book, but I'm doing a weekly essay. I plan to do it for at least a couple of years, and then we'll see where that leads us.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Yeah, I think you must have heard this term ABCD, right, Pallavi?
Yes, American born, confused, Desi.
Yeah, so I'm sure there's an English version and a European version of that. But yeah, I think it'll be quite interesting to see how that progresses. So Pallavi, should we just delve into this book? That's why we are largely here today. And
I would love to. Here it is. I saw you had your copy. How did you get on with it? I know you were taking a flight and had a dreadful sort of journey that was long and complicated. Were you able to actually do the speed reading, or was that
I did.
too much to ask?
I think I did. I think the book helped to sort of alleviate some of the travel pains.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
And I think I'm not a writer, nor am I a critic. But as a common man, I think I found your book very easy to read.
Yeah.
Phenomenally funny. I think you are not shy in your sense of humor. And I'm going to touch upon some of those things when we speak as we speak. But
if I might jump in, Chirag, that's a great compliment coming from somebody that Meeta introduced at the beginning for his wicked sense of humor.
Yes.
That's particularly nice to hear coming from you.
Yeah, you beat me, Pallavi. No, it was good. It was good fun, if we start with sort of chapter one, and I found the chapter. I mean, at first when I was reading it, I was like, I was orienting myself as to what am I reading, frankly. But I kind of got a sense that what you were doing at the front was setting the scene for the Japanese system and culture, so to speak. And you were interpreting that, through things like, the manner guides, which are there in the Japanese system. You reference India and China and the cultural connects and disconnects in the context of Japan. And then you talk about the Japanese moral code. Can you flesh this out so that people really, take some pegs from here and get inspired to read the whole book? But I found chapter one to be very illuminating.
Well, yeah, I mean, chapter one was setting the stage. It was interesting that you used the word orienting yourself. You said that you read the chapter to orient yourself. And, if I might, before going into the chapter, talk a little bit about the title of the book, Orienting, because I tried to do three things with it. One was to establish the fact that I was a naive, sort of ignorant about Japan person when I washed up in Tokyo in 2016. And so I was essentially having to orient myself. So, one meaning of orienting is that, of course, Japan is of the Orient. And so that's another reason for calling it orienting. And the third is that it's actually a nod towards the orientalizing that is so common when we speak of Japan. And, a lot of what we know of Japan is this kind of romanticized, aestheticized ideal with which a lot of Westerners have viewed Japan. So it was those three types of Orientalisms, orienting, the Orient, that kind of come into the title. And what I'm trying to do in the first chapter is give a sense of what it feels like to land up in a land that you know nothing about and where you don't speak the language. But it's a very interesting time, because during that time, and I found this through all the moves I have made in my life, and I've lived in Indonesia, I've lived in China, I've lived in Brussels, in Japan, in Spain now. But I find that that first 6 months, the first 1 year when you're in a new country, is a time where you really see, I mean, your eyes are wide open, all of your senses are kind of open to receiving information, because what you are seeing around you has not yet become normalized, it has not yet become banal, and as a result it's not yet become opaque. When you are sitting on a metro, you don't just kind of tune out into your own thoughts, you actually look at what people are reading, you look at the titles of the books that they are reading, you try to pick up on what they're saying, and if you can't hear it, you notice their body language. Do they cover their mouths when they laugh? Do they lean in? Do they lean out? When you are walking along the streets, you read the signs, you look on the floor and you notice the manhole covers. You know, all of these things, after a year or two of living somewhere, it goes. It's like some blinds come over your eyes and you stop noticing that. But that first year in a place, it's like when it's almost like a sixth sense, you know, like all your normal five senses are attuned in much more sensitive than they normally would be. And so that first chapter was really trying to kind of give a sense of what it might feel like for a foreigner to arrive in Japan, and what are those things that are quite banal to most Japanese or people who are long-term residents of the country but would leap out to the foreigner. And I think I talk about, for example, the fact that you have these 5 and 6-year-old children that are traveling across the city on their own. That's something almost impossible not to notice when you first go to Tokyo, although after 4 years it becomes so normal you stop noticing it. But I remember having come from Jakarta and being an Indian myself, a Delhi girl, where, you know, we literally send our children accompanied until they are in their mid-teens everywhere, to have these 5 and 6-year-old little children, you know, with heavy school bags, walking in this busy streets, going into the bowels of the Tokyo metro station. I initially thought they were lost, and I would go running after them to try to ask them if they needed help or if I could like find their parents, until I realized that they had these little pasmos, you know, these like Oyster cards in London, travel cards, and that essentially from the age of 6, that's when they start grade 1, all children in Tokyo commute themselves. Often they just walk in their neighborhood if they go to a public school, but private schools are located further away, in which case they commute. No schools have school bus services available. Everybody just takes the public bus system. So, I mean, I was blown away by this kind of sense of safety, because to me, I could imagine that in a kind of bucolic village where there's a population of 50 people and everybody knows everybody, but to be in this dense metropolis city with a population of 30 million people and have little kids and parents act as though it was a village, that level of security, that level of public trust, that level of civic consciousness and trust in the system, I think really blew my mind, especially having come from, you know, other countries like Indonesia, like India, like I was saying. You know, I always do think in a comparative framework as well. So I spent quite a lot of time talking about that. And I think the second thing was just this incredible labyrinth lost and found system that has been developed in Japan, so that I call it the country where what is lost is always found. And I begin, of course, by the very first week where I ended up losing my wallet and only discovering that I'd lost my wallet 2 days after I had lost it. And, you know, I was really disconsolate because I had credit cards from all around the world. It was going to be a real pain. It had my residence card for Japan, which was going to be very difficult to replace, and so on. And somebody suggested I go to the local Koban, which is a small little police chowki type of place, and report it. And, you know, being from India, like the last place I would go if I need help is the police. I'm sorry to say that, but it's almost like, why would I go to the police? But they were like, no, go. I went to report it. And as I was reporting it, they made various phone calls. And we discovered that the wallet had been found and turned in, and it was at a police station nearby. And to me, me, this just seemed like supernatural almost. And then I discovered that in Japan, this is not supernatural, it's very normal. And that they have something ridiculous like an 86% return rate of cash. So when you lose cash, you have an 86% chance of it just being turned in to the police. And we're talking about millions of US dollars every year, which are handled by the Tokyo police and just given back to people because they've been found. So it was quite remarkable. It was this kind of puzzle, like what is it about Japan and Japanese society that allows for this kind of level of, civic behavior, public trust, the cleanliness as well, being so used to people treating public spaces as something that doesn't concern them because it's not their private space. And then suddenly coming to a country where it's almost the opposite, where the public space gets paramount importance, where other people's needs, where other people's comfort kind of gets priority over your own. It was almost like a topsy-turvy, completely inverse way of looking at the world, society, culture, and your place in it to in many other parts of the world that I had lived in earlier.
Yeah. And I think you also touch upon this very famous example, right? Where trains, just recently, I think we read somewhere that some trains were a bit early than the scheduled time. And they were
that was 2017. I'm sure it's happened again. The incident that I referenced was in 2017, where it was 9 seconds early. And it caused such a brouhaha that the Tokyo Railway office had to issue a public apology because people were very irate about this. I mean, that it really does make it feel like it's an alternative planet, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you almost lead us into thinking and describing and making us feel probably comfortable that community first is perhaps the message, right, of your first chapter, that how elegantly in this jungle of Japan or Tokyo, they've managed to keep all of these things, the village traditions alive.
Community first, absolutely. And in a way that I don't think is the case in China. China is often brought up as an example of a community, because of a Confucian culture with communitarian values versus the individual values of the US. I, in fact, do not think that applies to China as much as it applies to Japan. I would say Japan is really the quintessential example of a culture where it's community first rather than the individual, and often to the detriment of the individual. I mean, there is a flip side to this.
Correct, absolutely. So yeah, that was fascinating. Then when I sort of skimmed through the subsequent couple of chapters, particularly chapter 2, I think I got a sense really that it was an express version of moral science taught very poorly in school. You bring it all together, referencing Japan and its moral fabric. And for example, you said that it is a quote from somebody where it says repairing pottery. So yeah, I think you begin that chapter by talking about repairing pottery, which is a big fascination in Japan. But it is not to hide it. You don't repair pottery to hide the cracks, but to highlight the imperfections. Please talk to that. This is a very profound statement and analogy here that you make.
So that method of pottery repair, of ceramic repair, which sounds so archaic, right? But it was actually one of the things I knew about Japan even before I moved there, because I remember having seen a Facebook meme somewhere, which was doing the rounds and is quite popular, of this gray bowl. And it was like a tea bowl, or a soup bowl. You might, in India, we would be more common to call it a soup bowl. And it had this kind of snaking line of gold running through it, where it had in fact been cracked because it was broken. And then when it was repaired and welded back together, the technique that was used was a technique called kintsugi, in which the idea is to actually highlight the crack and to show how the cracks themselves can end up making the object more valuable, more beautiful than it was when it was supposedly perfect and whole, which is why they use a gold lacquer, and it's actually like a gold powder on resin that they use to fill in the cracks, which actually then highlight it. So in many ways, I was fascinated by the philosophy behind this idea, because in many ways, this art, it inscribed the story of an object into the body of the object. By looking at its cracks, you knew what had happened to it, its history. It wore its history on its sleeve rather than hiding the history behind a mask, like often we have become used to doing. The moment of the breakage of that object, the fact that that object was loved enough to be repaired, that it is likely to be handled with care in the future, this really speaks to the human condition, not just to like ceramics or pottery repair, because I think all of us as human beings have been broken at some point, and the essence of who we are is not located in some flawless image of perfection that we might present to the world, but along the fault lines of our personal histories. And I think kintsugi, just as it encourages us to look at the object, a bowl of pottery, for example, and embrace its breakages, embrace its scars, it also allows us as human beings to think of the fact that our own cracks actually enhance our lives, enhance our beauty, and are not something to be ashamed of and hidden away, but something in some ways to flaunt, because this is who we are, warts and all.
Yeah, excellent. That was coming out very strongly, and equally, in on the same breath, you also talk about their patience, how they listen, the sort of the pause and the silences, and you equate this with wines, quite elegantly, where you say, where you say the French wines is about what's here, and the Japanese wine is about what's not in there or not there. Can you just flesh that out? That's quite fascinating as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that. I think something that all people, when they have the opportunity to interact with Japanese friends, Japanese colleagues or acquaintances, I think especially when you come from pretty loud, garrulous, talkative cultures like India or Spain, where I am right now, are quite struck by the fact that the Japanese tend to be far quieter, far more gentle, far more controlled in their responses. And very often, as an Indian, I found that I would fill the gaps. Like if I was with a Japanese friend, I would find myself talking ever faster, ever louder in some ways, because I found silence quite uncomfortable. And I sort of took the silence on the part of my Japanese interlocutor to mean that perhaps they were in some ways uncomfortable or unsatisfied with the situation. And it took me a while to figure out that they were actually just listening and absorbing what I was saying without necessarily feeling the need to immediately jump in with a response. And it took me quite a while to sort of dial back and allow myself to sometimes be comfortable with pauses, with silence, and not always feel like this was something that needed to be filled, that silence was something that needed to be filled with chatter. I think I read in David Pilling's book, to be fair. I mean, I must give him credit. He's the former FT correspondent in Japan, and he did a great book called Bending Adversity. And that quote about wine, French wine and Japanese sake was from his book, in which he's interviewing somebody and about Japanese culture. And I think they say something like, in French wine, when you are appreciating it, it's all about what's there. Like, is it oaky? Is it does it have tone notes of vanilla? What's the terroir? Like all of these adjectives that we fill the idea of wine with. And the best sakes are the ones which can almost taste like nothing. They should taste like water on your tongue. So it becomes all about the absence rather than trying to think about what are the things that are crowding it. And I thought that was quite an interesting metaphor to look at Japan through.
There's a downside. Yeah, there's a downside to that, isn't there, Pallavi, where where because the average alcohol content you quote in there is quite high, so you end up drinking quite a lot, and then it's sort of for many Japanese are often found sort of struggling to get out of the bars, but that's probably why, I guess.
So sake is very dangerous because of this.
Yes, because of that. Exactly. I think you bring that out in the book. I've experienced sake. I've fallen off as well once or twice. So as we are progressing, Pallavi, maybe just a kind of a sidebar question. I think you touched upon that, but how would you describe your style of writing, particularly for novices like us? How would we absorb Pallavi? And how would you describe yourself so that we can sort of understand you better, I guess?
Thanks for that question. It's quite hard to answer, to kind of step back and analyze yourself. And particularly given that I have written across such a wide variety of genres. But I think there's a few things that I tend to be interested in. One is that whole idea that we were talking about in the beginning about being Indian in the world. And I do feel like it's interesting to me to specifically examine the world with an Indian lens, not only to understand the world, but also to understand India better. Because I think the more we look outside, the more we are actually looking inside. It's a kind of dual journey. And all these places that I've written about, I have done consciously in a comparative framework to not only understand those places better, but through those places to try to understand the choices that our country has made better as well, and the implications of those choices, and to try to analyze how they could or could not have been different, what kind of different consequences would they have had. I've always been interested in diversity and plurality, and so I try to also look at issues and things that are kind of on the margins of the mainstream of any culture. So whether it was China, whether it was Europe, whether it's Japan, I'm not always looking at the main things, but at things that are happening on the side. Like, for example, in the Japan book, I spend quite a lot of time talking about the Buraku men, who are basically like the Dalits in India, a formerly untouchable, essentially caste of people that very few people are even aware of in Japan today, and they're certainly not part of the public discourse in Japan. But I'm interested in the invisible, not always just the visible, but what's going on the margins of different societies. I'm interested in gender, so I always try to talk about and think about women in a particular culture, in a particular society, and how they inhabit public space, how they act, how much agency they have, again in a comparative framework, because it's helpful, I think. And then I also try to foreground myself. I mean, I write a lot of nonfiction, but it's narrative nonfiction, so it has a narrative arc. It's almost told like a story. And I think there are two ways of writing nonfiction. One is where you basically disappear as the narrator, and you're talking about facts and you're putting the facts out there. And I think that sort of writing tends to lend itself to more authority, because then you kind of acting like the omnipresent, omniscient authority on the matter that's just telling you how things are. And what I try to do is a much more subjective, personal type of writing, where I'm not laying claim to telling you how things are. I'm essentially trying to show you how I see things, and also in that process lay bare myself, because I think that the reader should also be invited to see the writers or the observers' own lenses, like what is their background, why do they come to this conclusion? Perhaps because they're English speaking educated elite, perhaps because they're a woman, perhaps because they're an Indian, perhaps because they don't speak the language well enough to be able to dig deeper. I mean, all of us have failings, I think, as writers, and I want those failings to also be in some ways up in the center for the reader to examine, so that they know that what they are finally learning is mediated through me as a writer. And I think that's important, because I sort of resist this idea of guruship or panditry. And I don't think that, any book really can explain a country. A country is far too multifaceted and contradictory and chaotic and messy to be held between the covers of any single book. And I feel like, there's that old Jain parable where you've got 6 blind men and an elephant, and each one of the blind men touches a different part of the elephant and tells you what the elephant looks like. And somebody touches the foot and says, oh, it's like a tree. And somebody touches its tail and says, oh, it's like a snake. And somebody touches its, you come up with a completely different idea of what the elephant is, depending on which part you touch. And I think ultimately all of us as observers are like that. We only see one part of anything that we are observing. And so it's really, it's a hint, it's a subjective, partial, suggestive introduction to a place that's supposed to whet your appetite, hopefully intrigue you, hopefully help inculcate curiosity, a sense of respect and affection towards other cultures. At the same time, think a little bit more deeply about your own culture and what it has not done well, perhaps, and why and how it could do better. And, if I could have just encouraged people to read more, travel more, open their minds a little bit, I think that's essentially my goal always as a writer.
Chapter 3 and a few others, I picked up some terms, Pallavi, and you may sound very serious or you may look very serious, but I think you're not. That chapter is full of humor, and you use words like
glasses, then I look even more serious. Yes, go on. Exactly. Yes.
And now we talk about the humor part. You use words like hanami, and I'll ask you to describe it, what it means. Then you use words like shito, and I had to read it 3 times when you were mentioning shito. And then there was things like shit, shuri, shi, mashu, and all I could read was shit. And maybe I was jet lagged.
That's hilarious.
But how do you see that? I mean, how, some very interesting things in chapter 3. Why is there so much shit in Japan?
So much shit. I don't think there's much shit, but at all, actually. I mean, what's remarkable about Japan is how clean it is, and their toilets, which I've devoted an entire chapter to, ensure that there's very little shit, in fact, as you put it. But I think the bit that you were referring to actually found the page was about the different kinds of Japanese onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia are sounds that we make, like bau bau for a dog or meow for a cat. They're basically sounds that have meaning in them. And I discovered that Japanese has 4 different onomatopoeia to describe rainfall. And when the rain falls, shito, it's constant and enveloping. When it rains, za, it's a sudden downpour, typhoon strong. At the very outset of a shower, it rains potsu, a few early drops and a darkening sky. At this stage, it can also be para. Para is when it's a bit random, as though someone was spraying occasional moisture on plants out of a watering can. So, I think that's what you were referring to when you talked about the shito. It's basically an onomatopoeia for one type of rain. But Japanese actually, as a language, has a lot of onomatopoeia. They tend to use a lot of sounds to describe events, which I love.
And you said your chapter on toilets, fascinating chapter. In literally a few paragraphs, you sort of you bring in your mother, Narendra Modi, the local governments.
I think my mother might be attending this. Poor thing, she's with toilets.
But you bring them alive in that chapter, and I think. For me, it was my best chapter. It was chapter number 7. It was both hilarious, but you were just illustrating, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, on the perfection the Japanese system and the culture is, and how complicated it is also for common people. So talk us about your toilet chapter.
No, there is all of that. But, I've always been very interested in toilets, and not because I have an unhealthy obsession with bowel movements, but because I believe that sanitation is really key to understanding cultures, and, attitudes to sanitation are very important parameters of where society is and how it's progressed. And so it's something that I wrote a lot about in all my books, including my book on China, because I followed toilet cleaners in Beijing. I followed toilet cleaners in Indonesia. And so toilets have been something I've written a lot about long before Modi ji came to power and, started his toilet building spree. I've been writing about toilets for the last 20, 25 years. And I always felt that, Gandhi ji had identified toilet cleaning as something that was very crucial to ensuring dignity, human dignity. And, and then I always felt that along those parameters, China was more Gandhian than India was. So, when I was arriving in Japan, I was very excited. This was going to be a different toilet ecosystem to the China, Indonesia, India one, which was a more developing one. I mean, Japanese toilets were famously advanced and sort of uber tech. And indeed, when you go into a Japanese toilet, often there are as many buttons there as a kind of airplane cockpit, and it can be quite overwhelming. You don't know what to press. But I think the larger point is that what was amazing about toilets, like, okay, so you have children traveling alone in Japan. That's amazing. Many other things, lost and found things, you lose things, they're almost always returned. That's amazing. But the most amazing for me personally of everything was the cleanliness of toilets. And if somebody were to ask me what was my all-time favorite thing about Japan, we spent 4 years there, was it the sakura, was it sushi, what was it? I think I would say clean toilets. And the reason being because it completely transforms your experience of a woman in public space. Most of us, firstly, we are often in public spaces where we do not feel very safe. When you are then going to a toilet which is disgusting and unhygienic, you're not able to use that toilet, which means that it actually prevents you from often being in spaces where you will be in that position where you cannot use the toilet, a public park, a train station, all of those things. And the liberation of being able to be anywhere at any time and know that you can just go to the toilet. And women need to go to the toilet more often. I mean, just our physiognomy is different to that of men, so their need for the toilet is that much greater. Their need for clean toilets is that much later because they sit down, they can't do a no touch kind of use of toilet, and at the same time they can't use the great outdoors with impunity like men do in many of these countries. So toilets really end up becoming a sort of governing thing for a lot of women in how they can live their lives. And in Japan, I found that that sort of the toilet liberation I experienced of being able to stop, whether it was in a public park, whether it was in a metro station, whether it was a pit stop on a highway, and know that there would be a toilet and there would be a clean, safe, hygienic toilet. It was my number one favorite thing about my 4 years in Tokyo.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm just going to quote what you've written in the book. You said, Japanese toilets can do more things efficiently than some state governments in other parts of the world.
That's a joke. It's a joke.
Which was quite
Perhaps
funny.
that's true.
But,
there are toilets that can.
You're making the point. You're making a point.
There are toilets where they can test your blood sugar levels in your urine, take your pulse, take your blood pressure. It's really quite awesome, some of the things that a Japanese toilet can do. So indeed, they can sometimes feel more efficient than the governments of many countries that shall go unnamed.
Yeah. The other thing which struck me was this Indian movies and fascination for Rajnikant, this chap called Takida, somewhere you quoted the book. What's going on there? I mean, how come Rajnikant has ended up in Japan? I mean, how did that happen?
So, I mean, I wouldn't get carried away by that, because I think there are some people who seem to, because this Rajnikant phenomenon in Japan has been written about before, and I just want to tamp down expectations. He's not mainstream. It's not like he's the equivalent of Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt, or if, Rajnikant walked down the streets of Tokyo tomorrow, everybody would recognize him. But he's niche. He has a group of people who are obsessed with him, to the extent that, they have basically changed their lives. They dress like him. They have imported an auto rickshaw from Tamil Nadu and drive it around the streets of Tokyo. They burst into choreographed Bollywood, whatever, Rajnikant movie dance steps. Many of them have changed their professions so that they've become like Indian food caterers, dance teachers, mehendi artists, and so on, because of their interest in India that was evoked by Rajnikant to begin with. And the phenomenon really began in the mid 1990s. He had a movie called Muttu, which was called Odoru Raja or something like that in Japanese, and it just became hugely popular. And I think one of the only Indian movies to be shown in commercial cinemas over there. And it's difficult to know exactly why. The people I spoke to, said it was a tough time in Japan at the time. It was when the bubble years were ending, and suddenly there was stagnation, there was worry about the future, and this kind of offered a crazy escapism. And in everyday life, Japanese are quite buttoned up, and like the culture is one of essentially repressing and putting away your emotions, putting away your feelings. And Rajnikant is the opposite. I mean, he's as crazy and larger than life that you can imagine. And so you had reports of movie halls, in commercial movie halls in Japan, where normally people sit very quietly until the end of the movie, not only the end of the movie, but the end of all the credits. I mean, that's another thing that I noticed in Japan, that nobody gets up after the movie and leaves. They wait until all the credits finish rolling. But when they were showing this Muttu, this Odoru Maharaja, there were people who, like in Indian cinemas, were whistling and jumping up and dancing along with him. And it seems to have just allowed a kind of release in a lot of people who at the time especially were quite depressed and sad about their lives. So I think there was something about his irrepressible zaniness that was so improbable in Japan, which is so much the opposite, that it attracted, when you talk about opposites attracting, that it attracted a particular group of people. And so you now have Rajnikant fan clubs in most big cities in Japan, in Osaka, in Kyoto, in Tokyo, and several thousand people. I mean, like I said, it's not mainstream. I wouldn't say millions of people, but several thousand people in each of these cities who, have events every month. Whenever a new movie comes out, they'll host screenings. They visit Chennai to catch the premieres over there. And, their greatest wish is for their Talaiva, for Rajnikant to visit Japan soon.
And yet, on that topic of Indians in Japan, you also talk about your personal experience in the conversation with the counselor, I guess, in Tokyo, and you describe that India sort of town in Tokyo. But
Chirag, I can't hear you.
Okay, is that better, Pallavi?
That's better. I can hear you now.
Yeah. So on this topic of India and Indians in Tokyo,
yes.
Can you you described that quite well in the chapter, in your meeting with that first Indian elected councillor, I guess.
Yes, Yogi Puranik.
Yogi Puranik, from Pune or something, and but just for us, like I've never been to Japan. But what would the picture be? Would it be like the Edison in New Jersey or Southall in London? How would you describe that through your eyes and lens?
You mean the area, the sort of Little India in Tokyo?
The Little India in Tokyo. Yes.
Right. Well, it's truly little, and certainly not comparable to anywhere in London or the US or the Anglosphere, which have large, significant immigrant communities from India. But it has grown. And I think that the growth really took place post 2000, from what I've heard, where a lot of Indians started coming into work for IT companies. There was this whole idea that there was going to be that Y2K problem at the change of when the millennium started, and a lot of companies hired Indians at that time, and then that has grown. So we now have an area called Edogawa, which is in the eastern part of Tokyo, and that's where the majority of Indians live. But we're probably talking about a couple of thousand, maybe 4,000 people. It does have 2 Indian schools. It has a few Indian spice shops, a bunch of different restaurants. But you will not get this overwhelming Indian flavor that you would in Brick Lane in London or Southall or anything like that. What was interesting, though, was that Yogi Puranik was elected as a councilman for that area, because Indians, most Indians cannot vote. If you are not a Japanese citizen, you are not allowed to vote. So Yogi was not voted in by the diaspora. The diaspora, mostly temporary workers who lived there for a few years. So almost everybody who voted for him was Japanese. And that's a very rare phenomenon, because the Japanese are quite famously averse to sort of foreigners. They're very aware of their own culture and their own sense of being a part and of being Japanese, which is not multicultural, which is not a kind of immigrant culture, for example, like the US. And it's quite rare to have foreigners rise to any kind of level of authority, even within companies and multinational companies, leave alone in politics and local politics, which is why I think Yogi's story is very interesting, and possibly, the precursor of changes to come, because I think more and more we are arriving at a point in Japan's history where, I think greater openness is no longer a choice. It is becoming a necessity given their demographics. And so, I think it's really the start of a change that we are going to see Japan grappling with going forward.
No country, no country's description can be made if you don't touch the topic of food, and I think you do that also in chapter 6 very vividly. Just curious to know, Pallavi, that whilst you talk about that, just curious to know that did you get a chance to visit some of the distilleries? The sort of the Nika,
whiskey.
Suntory distilleries, which produce some of the finest whiskeys or some of the best gins.
I did not. I went to sake breweries.
So did you get a chance to do that?
So I visited sake breweries, but not the whiskey ones. Although, as you point out, Japanese whiskey has really taken the world by storm, and I believe that the next big thing is going to be Japanese gin. But I think the story of Japanese whiskey, the story of Japanese gin, the story of sake, I think all of them really show what they're pointing to is what is Japan's great USP, and that is the spirit of shokunin, or craftsmanship, that we see artisanship, that we see alive in Japan, which is really one in which processes become very important, and the ability to keep trying to reach a kind of elusive perfection, but not sort of give up. The thing is that the shokunin, or the craftsperson, the artisan, that's being the distiller, that's being the sushi chef, that's being the person making the yeast for sake, that's being a painter of woodblock paintings, for example, they are genuinely humble. They are aware that perfection is inevitably elusive, yet they do not give up on its quest. One lifetime may not be enough to master a craft, but the shokunin keeps trying and finds meaning in that attempt. So rather than the goal, it's the journey that becomes very important. And I think that really sums up Japan very beautifully. And it also, I think, I mean, it has its limitations. It means that in a kind of flexible, fast-moving environment, which requires you to change very quickly, the Japanese might not have the same kind of advantage as, say, the Chinese or even the Indians. But when it comes to really doing something to the best that it's possible to do it, become the best at, for example, producing whiskey, it is the Japanese that are going to do it.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, at one end, striving for perfection in whatever they're doing, as simple as making sure that trains run on time. And at the other end, if there are imperfections, then they're saying, listen, we're not going to hide it, and we're going to talk about it and do something, the pottery example. So a phenomenal country, I guess.
And it has contradictions, Chirag, as you point out. And the thing is that all countries have contradictions. So that's something that I became quite, being an Indian,
Correct.
You become very comfortable with that. We know the famous saying that anything that you say is both true and not true about India. But I realized that that's also the case for most places, that, there are contradictions that you will find. In Japan, for example, I feel that there was, on the one hand, a search always for simplicity, and on the other hand, a tendency to overcomplicate things. Many of these kinds of contradictions of, looking for perfection, of showing your scars. All of those two things can exist at the same time, and they do.
Correct. Yeah, the example of complication in your book is this whole garbage sorting.
Oh my God!
That for
it's Byzantine,
purposes, right? You said that you need a book. Yeah, you need a manual, I guess, to understand it. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Interesting.
So Chirag, we only have a few minutes left. I think we have 2 or 3 minutes left.
Yes.
Were there any questions? Otherwise, we can continue chatting. But I was just wondering if there were.
Guys, we can actually continue this if you guys have. That if both of you want to continue this, we can extend this for a while.
I have a maximum 10 more minutes, unfortunately, Urvi. I'll have to leave by about 10 past 4. Just a second. My cat is crying. 1 second, I'll just be back.
Sure. In that case, from the audience, if anyone has any questions, you can either raise your hands or send your questions in the Q&A option, and we'll just patch you through.
Yeah. So Urvi, I just want to end the session.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Hand it over to you. So
Absolutely.
I was actually through with my questions. So I think in conclusion, Pallavi, would you agree that Japan is steeped in tradition? It has difficult codes of conduct. It's complicated. It's perhaps averse to foreigners. But yet, I think through this session and of course through your book, it will probably inspire a lot many to visit and soak this country, which is interesting. And I promise to go there. I'm inspired, and I will definitely read the nuanced aspects of the Japanese culture and perhaps explore it through my eyes. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much. And we'll open the floor for questions now.
The pleasure is all mine, Chirag, and thank you very much for your really nuanced and detailed questions, and for finding the time to somehow read the book in the middle of your crazy schedule the last couple of days. I appreciate it hugely, and if I can persuade you to go visit Japan soon, then my job is done.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Over to you, Urvi, and the rest of the team.
Thank you, Chirag. Thank you, Pallavi. We've got a couple of questions on the Q&A already. But before I get to them, Sukant has raised his hand, so I'm just going to patch him through so he can ask his question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Sukant. Yes.
Good evening. I was curious to know the Japanese culture that you see today. Is it a creation of post Second World War, or is it an old culture which continues a pre Second World War culture which continues today as well?
Well, like in the case of most nations, it's a combination, right? So culture is not static.
Okay, because I'll add to the context. I'll add to what I was trying to ask. because
Okay.
you hear a lot about the pre Second World War and the Second World War Japan, which was very different. The military and the all of that. So I'm curious to know. Hear a lot of negative things about the Japanese from 1937 to say 1945. So this is the thing that you have on your mind. So curious to know about all the contradictions that I have on my mind about Japan.
Correct. So the militarization of Japan and the kind of the extent to which it went and overstepped any bounds of civilized conduct really in the pre-Second World War time when they invaded Manchuria and Korea and all of that. It was the product of a specific juncture in history. And post-Second World War, they had this pacifist constitution that was more or less forced upon them by the US. But I think if you were to look today, pacifism continues to be a great cornerstone of most people's thinking about their own country. So that despite the fact that they've had quite a nationalist, right-wing leaning political party and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe for years and years and years, they have been unable to change the constitution because of the fact that it's a very unpopular move. And for the majority of people, pacifism is really something that they would choose as the way forward. That said, you have a minority of ultra right-wing vocal groups, the Oyoku Dankai, and I write about them extensively in the book because they just stick out as such an anomaly. We were talking earlier, Sukant, about how Japanese can be very quiet and sort of contained and so on, and then you've got these crazy militaristic old people. Basically, it's usually people in the 70s and 80s, these octogenarians riding around in jeeps, souped up jeeps, as though they are in the middle of a Mad Max convoy with these huge loudspeakers, screaming invective against Koreans, screaming invective against Japanese, blasting military music, flying the old imperial flag of Japan, and are basically unreconstituted, unapologetic, military imperialists who sort of believe that Japan was unfairly treated during the war. And so you've got that minority of people, and they continue to certainly exist, and they have quite a lot of influence amongst the highest levels of the LDP, which is the party in power. But I don't think that that describes the sort of general or common attitude in Japan at all. And unlike China, which had a communist revolution and therefore systematically dismantled its traditional culture, Japan never had that. So if you're looking at Japanese traditional aesthetics and culture and the little Shinto shrines, temples, the way in which people pray, the way in which people conceive of their relationship with the spirit world, and then, of course, all the arts and crafts and traditions that have honed over the centuries, you still see them alive in modern Japan, juxtaposed next to the neon and the glitter of places like Ginza and Shinjuku. So, like I said, it's a bit of both. You have the traditions and you have a very thoroughly modern, futuristic Japan coexisting. You have a peaceful, pacifist Japan, which is really focused on the principles of Zen in many ways, and you do have a militaristic aspect, again, coexisting. We talked earlier about contradictions and how all countries have their contradictions. Japan is no exception.
Thank you, Pallavi. We have one more question. What are young people in Japan like? Are they as overworked and stressed as news reports tell us?
Well, it's difficult for me to answer that except in a generality. It's a general question. Obviously, different young people are located and situated differently and have different experiences. But on the whole, it's difficult to be young in Japan. Firstly, the demographics are such that they're declining. So Japanese young people have essentially to often look after their parents and their grandparents without large sibling support. It's difficult to get a job and earn. The old salaryman structure of the big Japanese corporations is no longer really sustainable sustainable, but they haven't been able to move into this brave new world of startups and have a kind of Japanese version of Silicon Valley either. So the path forward is more uncertain for Japanese. They've been in an economic, not in a recession, but in a kind of holding pattern for 20, 30 years. So it's not as though people see their lives getting better and better. At the same time, the culture itself does tend to always stress obligations and duties and responsibilities over rights and privileges, which means that for young people, it can often feel like a major burden. We do see high suicide rates. We do see people committing suicide because of overwork. Japanese actually has a word for that called karoshi, which is death by overwork. We see a lot of people who are what we call hikikimori. Hikikimori are young people, or now we are discovering not so young people also, who essentially cut off all contact with the world and lock themselves up at home in a room and enter this virtual world of video games and sort of opt out of society. And upwards of 1 million of Japanese people are classified as hikikimori. So, there's all of that. At the same time, you will also see young, dynamic, entrepreneurial people who lead very happy and fulfilled lives. So, you'll see a range of different kinds of young people, just like you would in many other parts of the world. But things have been challenging, I think, for the youth in Japan, given their demographic makeup and given the economic circumstances.
Thank you, Pallavi. Do you have time for one more question?
Last question, please.
Absolutely, the last one. Yeah, Meenal, go for it.
The question reads, did you try to analyze the reasons for re-emergence of Japan in the post-World War period from a defeated and occupied country to one that today determines the fate of the world in a big way, and yet in a non-intimidating and non-threatening way? And how are people coping up with it so bravely despite having frequent natural calamities?
So there's a lot of resilience. I think resilience is like one of the main sort of Japanese virtues that is instilled right from a very young age through family systems and school systems, which is this kind of non-complaining, get on with it attitude. And it's also a very compliant, rules-bound society, which is very aware of how to behave in different crises. I mean, virtually the first experience I had when I moved to Japan was that I was given an earthquake survival kit and sent off to receive 3 hours of instruction on how to behave in case an earthquake hit. And all Japanese go through this from a very young age. The result is that when you've had calamities like Fukushima and you've had these huge tsunamis, you've had big earthquakes, most foreigners have been amazed at the resilience and the discipline with which the ordinary Japanese people responded. In many other countries, there would be chaos, there would be stampedes, there would be looting, whereas in Japan, people waited hours patiently in queues, for a bottle of water from a supermarket. They did not hoard. And, if they didn't have electricity, they just got on with it. So I think that those are traditional virtues that are emphasized and reinforced through the family system, through the school system, and then, through institutions as well, just the kind of training of how to cope with emergencies, with crises, how to behave, is something that's constantly reinforced throughout the average person's life.
Super. Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, Chirag, for this wonderful, wonderful session. Pallavi, we won't take more of your time. This was a very, very interesting session, and I think I can say that on behalf of all of us attending today. Before I let everyone go, I'd also like to thank the partners and the sponsors, Prabha Khaitan Foundation, Shri Cement, Ehsaas Women, and the Spagia Foundation. And Siahi is, of course, always very, very happy to conduct these sessions for everyone. For everyone in the audience, please send your names and addresses on the number 94615-44002 in the next 48 hours, and we'll send you a copy of Pallavi's beautiful, beautiful book, Orienting.
That's great.
Once all of you have your copies, I'm sure you can't wait to read them. I can't wait to read mine as soon as I get it. Until next time, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you to everyone, especially to Chirag and also to Urvi and everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much.